Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Damien Mander. Damien is the founder and CEO of the International Anti-Poaching Foundation, IAPF, which delivers ecological stability and long-term protection of large-scale wilderness landscapes by supporting and empowering local communities. Damien is the winner of the 2019 Winsome Constance Kindness Gold Medal. He was featured in the James Cameron documentaries, The Game Changers, and National Geographic's Akashinga, The Brave Ones. His TEDx talk at the Sydney Oprah House on speciesism has been translated into 27 languages. He is a resident on the National Geographic Live Speakers Bureau, has lectured at the UN, Harvard University. He was featured in June 2019's National Geographic Magazine, 3 times on 60 Minutes, and recognized by the Dutch government as a gender champion. In this conversation, we talk about Damien's path from soldier to ranger trainer, his misconceptions when starting out in conservation, and the learning process that followed. We talk about the beginnings of the IAPF and what it's grown into today. We dive into Akashinga and lead ranger, discuss public speaking and the power of storytelling, and go deep on the meaning and power of purpose and commitment. So much to take away from this one. So without further ado, here's Damien Mander. All right, Damien, welcome to the Rhino Man podcast. It's a real honor to have you on here.
Thanks very much, mate. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And just as we were talking before the show, I think the first time I actually met you and started to learn more about what you were doing in your neck of the woods was at the World Ranger Congress in 2019, which seems like such a long time ago now.
Yeah, geez, I mean, time goes so quickly, hey? And since then, the world's been sort of brought to its knees with this global pandemic, and that's a direct result of the way we treat nature. So it's probably never been a more relevant topic than speaking about the people that are out there on the front lines defending nature, and that's rangers. So thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. And excited to dive into the rangers and the work you're doing. There's just a lot of different topics I want to cover with you, but why don't we start out kind of at the beginning, like you've done so many times, but maybe defining what courage is for you, because I've listened to some of your talks and I feel like that was a big part of what drove you at the beginning in your early days. Maybe from your perspective, what is courage and why was that important to you growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at different points in our life, courage is always something evolving. When we're kids, courage may be standing up for someone in the playground that's being picked on. It may be doing something that we've never done before. I think as we got older and we collect experiences along the way, it can start to mean different things. And I think, as someone who's done the time in the military and a bunch of years in Iraq and in places that a lot of people probably wouldn't consider going to, probably say that the most courageous thing I've done is follow my heart and my conscience and dedicate my time and effort towards those less fortunate, being animals and the people that protect them. And that for me, it was a big step, but it was an easy decision, if that makes sense, when you were confronted with what was going on. But, we're here on this podcast today. You've invited me on. I get invited onto a lot of podcasts and a lot of people, do, what are the right words, do give a lot of credit for the organisation that's been set up and the work that we do. But for me, it's never seemed like a tough choice. It just seemed like the only choice. But to frame it, I left a family behind in Australia. I left well-paying jobs. I left behind a career. I left behind the comforts that come with us with living in Australia. And I live on the other side of the world. I do a tough job, where people's lives are in danger. There's daily challenges, and all of that, I suppose, is the makings of courage, is being able to take a decision to do that without really thinking about the decision itself, but just doing it because it was the right thing to do.
That's well put. And maybe we could bounce around a little bit back and forth. I don't know if you can give us just the brief overview of, what, I guess, your coming of age, growing up, youth, and that decision to go to the military and how that eventually led to this big decision to what you're doing today.
Yeah, I'll give you the elevator pitch.
Yeah, we can kind of dive back in here and there, but give us the overview first.
Yeah, I was raised on the east coast of Australia, born in Melbourne, raised in Sydney, moved back to Melbourne early teenage years, and just grew up freediving. Every chance I had, I was in the water. down before school, free diving. I used to go and collect the fishing lures that had been lost overnight, people that were fishing for squid or calamari. And I would sell these lures back to them and turn that into a good little business. Started saving up, doing dive courses. And then by the time I was sort of 17, I was just infatuated with the underwater world. And then I suppose for any kid that loves diving, the dream job is to be a diver in the Navy. So that's what I set out to try and become. The minimum age for joining the military in Australia is 17 years and 9 months, and I tried to join at that stage, and I didn't get in. At the time, they were only taking divers that were already within the military. You had to transfer across from another category. So I sort of, at the crossroads. I'd been working as an electrician, lost my job, was then working as a garbologist, so chasing a garbage truck. Yeah, no, that's what it's called, garbologist. So I was working on the back of a garbage truck in the middle of a Melbourne summer, boiling hot, chasing this garbage truck all day. Just all this bin juice running down your arms every time you lift one of those bins up. This is before like the mechanized version where you get the prongs that come out and lift the bin into the truck. A bunch of the people I was hanging out with at the same time were doing and selling a lot of drugs. And so there's me out all day chasing this garbage truck in the hot sun, and there's these guys sitting back partying all day, and that it seemed like a pretty much easier option. And anyway, I heard about the Navy, decided to join, enroll to join the Navy again, not as a diver, just as an electronics technician, and then with the plan to transfer across. But it was like a 6-month lead time. So I'd signed up, I'd passed the induction to go into the Navy, and I was waiting. And I didn't want to wait and be a garbo, chasing this garbage truck. So I went and started hanging out more with my mates that were selling the drugs, and that sort of became my time between then and going across to the military. And I remember it was about a week before I went to the military, and I turned up. I wasn't as heavily involved as what my other friends were, but I turned up to their house early in the morning, and 4 of them were face down on the front lawn, surrounded by police cars. And I wound my window down. I still couldn't really piece together what was going on. These guys were all handcuffed. All my mates were handcuffed. And this big guy, later found out was a detective, came over. He's in a suit. He came over and just leant on my car and put his head in my window. He's like, "Mr. Mander, would you like to join your friends, or would you like to go to the Navy next week?" Obviously he knew everything about me. I just said, "Yeah, please, sir, let me go and join the Navy." He said, "Get the fuck out of here." Of those 4 friends, 2 are dead, and 1 recently just got back out of prison again. So, yeah, sometimes all you need is just a stranger to give you a break. I went off, joined the Navy, transferred category as soon as possible to become a Navy diver, put myself through the clearance diver acceptance test, which is our version of what the Navy SEALs would call BUDS. It's Hell Week, but it goes for 12 days. It exposes you to the 4 pillars of misery: to be hungry, cold, tired, and wet. And at the end of it, there's a few people left standing. And at the end of ours, there was nothing special about me compared to all the guys that had come off, other than when everyone else said it's too hard or it couldn't be done. I was like, no, fuck it, I'm going through with this. I went over and started dive training, qualified, graduated, spent my time in the dive team, spent my time at sea. September 11 happened, changed the world for a lot of people, changed the world for me. With the Australian government standing up a new special operations unit called Tactical Assault Group East. They needed snipers that were qualified as divers. So the Navy sent a contingent across for selection, and I was one of those people. I managed to graduate and went and spent the rest of my time in the Australian military with sniper platoon before heading off to Iraq. That's the sort of pre-Africa story.
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't mind, there's a couple things I want to dig into. Going back to the diving, what really attracted you to that as you were growing up? And I don't know if you can explain what that feeling was or what that attraction was to people that may not have experienced that.
No, it was it's just like this underwater world. It's like a different dimension, you're in your own space down there. And plus, I had like this little entrepreneurial business going with selling these fishing lures. So, I was able to turn something I loved into something that could bring in an income, which is as a 14-year-old is, it's a pretty good deal, hey. And then being able to use that money to invest back into buying scuba gear and doing scuba courses and being able to spend more time underwater and go to different places. And I absolutely love salt water. I love being near the ocean. Just, I don't even have to be in it, just near it. Just come back from visiting our projects in Mozambique. We've got about 50 kilometers of coastline there, just off the Mozambique Channel, just offshore, and just the energy from the ocean for me. Some people love the mountains, some people love the forest, some people love the African bush. For me, it's always been the ocean.
Mm. And when you went from diver to kind of moving more towards the sniper in the military, I mean, did you feel kind of a loss at all, or were you kind of separated from it at that point?
I mean, the term "fish out of water" has never been so relevant. So we went through, our sniper course was through the Australian SAS, the Special Air Service. So we were attached to them for the sniper course, and they actually had to put us Navy guys through the course first as a practice run before we actually went and did the course, because none of us had an absolute clue what we're doing. And I remember we did, our first, it's called a CNC, camouflage and concealment. So they give you 7 minutes to go out, and you got to hide yourself and be able to observe the target without being the spotter, and then be able to take a shot and hit the target. And at the end of the 7 minutes, one of the sergeants is walking around in the field, and there's me sort of half tied to a tree. He's just like, "Dude, what the fuck are you doing?" I was just like, "Dude, I don't know. I actually don't know what I'm doing. We never did this shit in the Navy. I was, I'm fantastic in the water, but you got to teach us some of this stuff, eh?" So, but it was a steep learning curve. Probably, actually, all my life, probably the steepest learning curve. Going from being someone whose job is to be underwater to now be, turn into a ghost in the bush. But, got through. Fantastic instructors. It was the toughest course I ever did. It wasn't one of these normal sort of courses where you've got people yelling and screaming at you, which had been my experience with special operations up until then. It was very much just tell you calmly how things are done, show you how to do it, and give you one chance to get it right. You either get it right or you don't.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of related to that is, you kind of talked about that commitment going through your version of the Hell Week. And I don't know, do you know where that comes from? Because a lot of people don't have that, but I think to do anything with real purpose in life, you have to have that level of commitment or willingness to push through the pain. I don't know if that was something that you experienced in any other way growing up, or did that just kind of well up in you in that moment? Maybe talk a bit about what that is like and how it's useful.
Look, I remember finishing those 12 days and just feeling invincible. And actually, up until this point in life, whenever anything seemed hard, I just be able to look back on those 12 days and just know that you can get through anything. And these courses are designed to make you fail. So honestly, and the one key to success on those 12 days that has carried true in absolutely everything that we've been able to make work, as an individual, as an organization, over the years, is just perseverance. Just never fucking give up. Humanity's full of people that are ready to give up, and the easiest way to get ahead is just don't be one of those people that gives up. And honestly, it could be stubbornness, could be stupidity. Sometimes you got to walk away from things, but if it means something to you, and you've got the purpose to be there, you just don't give up. It will eventually work out. It will eventually come right. Even if you've got to go through that selection process 2 or 3 times, even if it takes you a decade, whatever it may be, if you don't give up, you'll eventually get it right. The conservation career, I mean, I've got to tell you, I'm sure we'll get into it, but, there's been some tough, dark moments, especially getting started in a very pointy-elbowed industry where it's very hard getting started. I get emails all the time from people. They're like, "Hey, just, where do we start? How do I get involved?" And then to be a foreigner coming over trying to do that, and in particular in the anti-poaching space, it's very rarely that people will hold out their hand and pull you in and say, "Hey, this is how it's done." And people are sort of sitting there watching, waiting for you to fail. And I think that's actually one of the detriments of our industry, being conservation, is that quite often our biggest threat is ourselves. So it's a group of people that are fighting over funding, public attention, and projects. And I often think if we could just be more collaborative in how people go about our operations and how we work, then we could be a whole lot further along. It's an extremely tough space. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can dive into some more of that as we talk about how IAPF came about. But yeah, I think that's something else you kind of learn too, is that no one really knows what they're doing through life. We're all just kind of figuring it out. So
Yeah,
if you have the ability to persevere and commit and just keep working until it kind of unfolds in front of you,
yeah.
you'll eventually get there. But it's hard sometimes when you're in those dark places.
And look, I mean, when you become a master at stuff when you stick it out, and if you spend a decade trying to figure something out, you're a fucking Jedi by the end of that
Yeah.
time. I mean, you can go to university and you can learn stuff in a classroom, and that's, there's great application for a lot of that. But when you're out there in the real world, and food on the table at the end of the day depends on you getting it right. It's a do or die sort of mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people in the conservation space kind of put themselves in that
Yeah,
position where it's do or die too. Same in the filmmaking world, which that's kind of my background. But sometimes you need that. You need to burn those boats behind you to keep moving forward.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
So why don't we jump into how IAPF came about? Maybe talk a little bit about how your military career wrapped up, and I think purpose is probably a big part of this discussion, and what purpose meant to you, and how this all developed. But tell a little bit of that story, and then we can dive in deeper.
So I'd finished, it was around the end of 2007 in Iraq after spending almost 3 years there on the ground. I'd done Australia's like a well-paid military. Then I'd worked as a private contractor in Iraq. So I'd done well financially by that stage. I built up a property portfolio, primarily in Australia, some property in Dubai, and I didn't need to work for the foreseeable future. I took myself to South America and started traveling. I started in Buenos Aires, finished 11 months later in Panama. What I told myself was a reward for having a successful military career, still having 10 fingers and 10 toes after 3 years in Iraq, and having done well financially. This trip was a reward. It was a year off, vacation, sabbatical, whatever you want to call it. But that turned into, I mean, South America, depending whether you turn left or right. At each place you go, it can be a party, or it can be a chilled occasion. And I was always turning towards the party, and that turned into a pretty rapid downward spiral of drugs and alcohol, which, yeah, it was tough. I've gone from being part of tight knit military units, having purpose, having mission, regardless of what that mission and that purpose was, we still had it, to then being alone, not having the people around me that previously I would have considered as close as a brother. And it was a brotherhood. And then I think for a lot of people in the military that they struggle afterwards when it is over, when you're trying to reintegrate back into society and trying to figure out the what next, or where's the purpose. And you've just gone from being part of an SF unit, and now you're driving an Uber, or you're back at home with a screaming child, trying to figure out what to do, and explain to a partner why you can't think straight, or why you don't think you belong here, or why you don't fit in. Yeah, and for me, I suppose for a lot of people, alcohol and drugs is an easy way to numb that when everything's gone.
Do they prepare you at all for that experience? Because I feel like this is, you hear this a lot, but or did you even realize that this was coming at you when you were leaving? Because it is, you have this insanely high level skill sets that you're using every day, working so closely with people that your life depends on forming those brotherhoods, like you said. And then you kind of leave that, and it feels like there's not really much of a transition period there. I don't know if you saw this coming, or thought that there were any warning signs, or it just kind of happened and you found yourself there.
They say they prepare you, and they you do some short courses and you get some certificates, and maybe it's gotten better since I was there. But ultimately, I see a lot of people leave the military. I see some of them be very successful. I see many that get back into the military. It's like going back to a safe home, safe family. Uh, and I see some that just completely unravel and never really find their feet. And then amongst all that, there's people in the middle. I'd like to think, if old men are going to send their children across to fight their arguments, and they need to be better at picking up the pieces when the kids come back home.
Yeah. So where did you go from there in the midst of all this partying?
Yeah, no, I, sort of hit rock bottom, and I had to get out of South America. I'd heard about anti-poaching in Southern Africa, and went home to Australia briefly, packed my stuff and left. Came to Africa, just trying to get involved, trying to get a foot in the door. It was only going to be a 6-month gig, 6-month adventure, just coming over and essentially running around the bush, being an anti-poaching ranger. I thought it was that easy based on the knowledge that I had from the military, that I could just come and walk into any organization, and you sort of slowly start to see that, hang on, there's people that have spent decades building up reputations and organizations and projects. They don't just want some cowboy running around having an adventure on the coattails of their hard work. And that sort of made me realize, I had to sort of adjust, my approach. And I'm fairly selfish, I would say. Growing up, I joined the military for adventure. I went to Iraq to make money as a contractor, and I came to Africa looking for a fight, not a cause. And then it was just spending more and more time with different ranger units, even though I wasn't able to work with them. Spending time with more rangers, more people involved with conservation. I started to say, all right, okay, hang on, there's a lot more substance to this than looking for a fight. There is actually a cause behind it. And then it was eventually working with a group of rangers in Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. It gave me the opportunity for full immersion into what it was in the life of a ranger. When was that? Sort of mid-2009. Got to spend more and more time with conservationists. And obviously, spending time with conservationists, you're spending time with their mission, which is wildlife and protecting nature. And so there's a lot of changes going on in my mind at the moment, at that moment, and conscience and all of that.
Yeah, I feel like this transition that you made, and I had a great chat with our friend Boris as well, and I think he made a similar transition.
Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of common in folks that come from the military side into conservation, but you hear a lot of the conservation groups that are established, that are doing good things, and they always kind of grimace when they hear of groups that are coming in the wrong way. And maybe this is something we can get into a little bit more once we start talking about ranger training. But I don't know if you can talk about some of the specifics of what you noticed in yourself in terms of what you were thinking it was going to be, and then what you started to realize, oh, I'm missing this part of the context that is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's an important conversation to have. And I wish someone had had the conversation with me earlier. But it was, I came across thinking it's just going to be the Wild West. You're sort of having to figure things out for yourself. But it was, my greatest teachers became the rangers themselves. Where I thought I was coming across to teach them, it was them that taught me. And still to this day, just so much to learn. And I don't mean just from the bush and the daily work they do, but in who they are as people and the dedication they've made. And, rangers inspired me in a way that in a world that was hard to be inspired in a way that I hadn't been inspired before. I've been in Iraq, I've been part of these super cool military units doing stuff in real life that kids can't even do on a PlayStation. But, with time to look back on Iraq and what all that meant, it was hard to find the purpose amongst all of that. Whereas the purpose behind what the Rangers was doing was very up front and centre. And it's very hard to not see that. When people ask you to tell you about your transition and all of that, people like to be able to put a pinpoint in that timeline and say, oh, this is where it all changed. And look, there are definitive moments for me where I made certain decisions, but the reality is the evolution took many, many years of going through from where I was as a kid, the work that I'd done, the things that I'd seen, what I'd been a part of, and then coming to Africa and experiencing it firsthand. And, there are a lot of people trying to launch their conservation career from a series of emails on the other side of the world. And I say to them, the difference between those that actually figure it out are the ones that get on a plane and come over and try and do it face to face around a campfire. And those are the 1%.
Yeah, there's a book I was reading recently. I don't know if you've read any of Stephen Pressfield, but he has some really good short little books like The War of Art. And he just put one out called Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be.
Yeah, awesome.
And it's kind of, a big part of it is, if you, it's a lot of it's geared more towards the creative life, but entrepreneurial life, starting a conservation organization, all these things have, very similar aspects and challenges you have to go through. And, a huge part of it is making that commitment and moving to where the thing is that you want to do is a huge part of that, and showing that you're willing to make that sacrifice and be there and be on the ground. It just changes the game a lot. So that really resonates with me, what you're saying about, you can't do this from across the ocean. You got to get in there and be with people. And, I think this goes to a lot of, even on Instagram, and some people that start these articles that are, get everyone all heated and up in arms, from people that, there's so many nuances that you can't know about or have experience unless you've spent days, weeks, months, years on the ground with people. So
Yeah.
super important.
No, it's. I go back to before talking about that experience and those hard-won yards, and it's we don't know where we're going to start. Sometimes it's just a matter of knocking on doors or meeting people or seeing where your break is. But for me, I always knew it was never going to be in a classroom, and it wasn't going to be at home. I had to go out into the world and find it.
Yeah. So back to how you started IAPF. Talk about some of that transition, maybe some of those key moments that inspired you to actually take that leap and, choose a name and create an organization and start building that.
So I'd been working mostly out in Wangi National Park, between there and this anti-poaching unit in Victoria Falls. So when I was out in Wangi, I was part of this darting team, just assisting with them in the background, collaring animals and data collection. And I was just trying to figure out how I was going to do something more sustainable with my desire to be involved with conservation. I was actually trying to figure out if I was going to stay there and continue a conservation career, and I had the enrollment forms for Silwood Catering College in Cape Town. I wanted to go and be a chef. And so I was like literally 50-50. I was back in Victoria Falls. Yeah, there was a couple of incidents. One was seeing an elephant with its face cut off, and another was seeing a buffalo with its leg caught in a wire snare that had ripped its pelvis apart, trying to get out, and having to euthanize that animal and having it start to give birth to a stillborn calf. It was a very, very quick decision from there. But, if I'd seen that a decade earlier, I'd probably be like, oh, fuck, that's a sad story. What next, it wouldn't have affected me, but Iraq, just time on this planet, the experiences had a way of sort of breaking down the armor that I'd built around myself, the persona, the ego. It allowed me to see something that I previously wouldn't have been able to see or absorb or be able to make decisions on. And I was in a place where I, was financially stable enough to be able to do something about it and have that freedom. And I chose to set up the IAPF back in I think October the 13th, 2009 is when we first registered. Yeah, I fell into cadence with an industry that was becoming increasingly militarized or focused on the law enforcement side of conservation around the time of the beginning of what was later termed the Rhino Wars. Elephants were top of the list for poachers. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And I just sort of fell into, with my background, I was like, how can I be involved with training rangers to be that last line of defense for animals? And to me, it seemed like all of conservation was anti-poaching. I didn't understand that anti-poaching is just a small slice of a much bigger holistic model that needs to be implemented to be able to achieve a conservation of nature at scale. But at the time, that's all. It's the only lens that I had to look through. I didn't have anyone tapping me on the shoulder saying, hey, this is how I think you should be doing things, or maybe you could do things differently, or maybe you could fit in with us over here. It was like, go and figure it out yourself. It was very much almost to the letter from someone who, very prominent rhino conservationist in Zimbabwe, literally just said, go and find the anti-poaching unit and figure it out yourself. Whereas, here we are 13 years later and millions of dollars raised. Maybe if I had some of the right advice in the early days, some of that money could have been spent directly into impact in the beginning rather than school fees, for lack of a better term, figuring things out.
Yeah.
But I started the only thing I knew how, the only place I had, and that was going out training rangers. Anyone that would have me or listen, spending time in the bush. and just to slowly scale the organisation up over, let's say, over the next sort of through to 2015. Obviously, there's some peaks and troughs over those years. But 2015 is when we started scoping the project in Mozambique along the border of Kruger National Park, which was really our first big major program, which I could say would sit on a global stage as significant in regards to rhino conservation.
I want to talk just a little bit more about the early days and, what some of the first things you were developing, and maybe even just for you, how it felt in terms of, I don't know if it felt risky or not, but first, before that even, why the International Anti-Poaching Foundation? Why such a really long name, like so many other conservation organizations choose?
So I've just got to give you the good side of that story first. Is that we currently about 3/4 of the way through a full rebrand as an organisation, and we expect to go live with that in Q1 of 2023. So we're going to see the year out, bearing in mind that December, second half of November through to the end of the year is we raise between 25 and 33% of our funding during that time. We don't want to rock the boat, and then next year we'll relaunch with a new name, new logo.
That's
basically
exciting.
Yeah, it is, and a lot of the language around what we do and who we are now has changed. It's just the name has remained. The name, I don't know. My background is in counterinsurgency warfare, not in branding or naming organisations or even conservation. At the time we set up, just sort of playing around with names that would be focused on Zimbabwe, and it's like, well, maybe we do something beyond Zimbabwe. Maybe we can do something, anywhere. So I wanted to give a name that had that reach or potential. And then, of course, the anti-poaching side. Just before we set this up, I didn't even know what NGO stood for. So there's a hell of a lot of learning going on.
No, I mean, I'm just teasing you a bit because I feel like so many names in this space end up becoming acronyms because they're so big. I mean, even ours, Global Conservation Corps, most people say corpse instead of core. So just giving you a hard time, but excited to see that rebrand.
That's all good, man. Not as much as me and the rest of the team.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of actually starting this, I mean, did it feel like a risk to you at all? I mean, how much did you go all in? Because I think, for other people that are getting involved or maybe thinking of starting an organization, it can be a pretty big leap of faith to jump in, and you kind of have to go all in if you want it to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, look, some people get started and have a bit of a longer runway. Some people spend more time figuring things out before they go all in. I'm more of a sledgehammer approach. So I just sort of throw everything at the wall and see where the crack appears. Yeah, as I said, I was in a good financial position. So just made a decision to start liquidating property in Australia and putting it towards the initiatives that I was involved with. And around the same time, understanding that wasn't going to be sustainable and that there needed to be a mechanism behind that, which obviously became the organisation, the IAPF, to support that growth and expansion. Just going back to those early years, it was really, really tough times. I mean, we did take off reasonably quickly, and then in I think it was March 2012, there was an article that came out front page of the Australian newspaper, which is like our version of the Washington Post, and it was talking about Australian special operations spies operating in Zimbabwe and Kenya. That was the end of my Zimbabwe story, pretty much overnight. Had nothing to do with me, but it was guilt by association, and I was subsequently out of the country for 2.5 years. I'd just finished building a house in the country. Had just signed a deal with national parks into the feasibility study for Chisarira National Park. Purchased a lease on a piece of land adjacent to Chisarira National Park with a lodge there, which was to become our headquarters. I went from all of that, and having just invested the majority of my life savings into Zimbabwe, to basically living in a backpackers in Kempton Park on the outskirts of Johannesburg with nothing. I remember looking at one point, we're down to about $2,000 left in the bank account. That at the time was a very bitter, tough pill to swallow. And actually, if I've got to sum it up, it turned us into the resilient organisation that we are. We stopped focusing just on Zimbabwe, obviously, we started looking abroad. We found the project in Mozambique, facilitate that. We set up in South Africa and Mozambique to fund it. We registered as a 501c3 charity in the United States, and we turned a situation that I would say a lot of people probably would have just walked away from into an opportunity that's forged us into the organisation we are today. Came back to Zimbabwe in 2016 and started building a portfolio of land in partnership with local communities, where we've now got 8 reserves that we have mandate for or leases on to protect. So yeah, went from being persona non gratis to being one of the largest conservation employees in the country, with around 500 staff and contractors now.
Yeah. What kept you going at that low moment? I mean, obviously you were driven to continue. What pushed you through that hard time?
Obviously, the foundation of the mission and the belief in what we were doing, and the fact that it's a job that needed to be done, and if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. Just because it was hard doesn't mean the job didn't need to be done. We just had to find a way to do it. Zimbabwe for me was always, I've been fortunate. I've traveled the world. I've been to so many places, and Zimbabwe is the place I choose to live. It's a beautiful country with beautiful people. I find it very safe, but it's also a country that's lacking a lot in international support, but with such beautiful wild places. So this is a space that didn't feel as though it was sort of moving furniture around in the conservation world when there's so many initiatives going on, rubbing shoulders with each other. This was a place that you could really go out and create your own projects and not be one of a dozen different organizations trying to do something in the same area. But of course, and the blank canvas we had in the creation of Akashinga as an evolving conservation model could really only come from a place like Zimbabwe. And being able to refine the systems that we built here in Zimbabwe and be able to take those further afield to surrounding countries now is, you've got to, I wouldn't change anything despite how hard things have been and how challenging. And inspiration as well too, along the way. I've got to say thank you to the critics, because without the critics, that's just that little hot ember that just keeps burning and eating away at you. And rightly so, deserves some critics over the years. And they've definitely been a very strong helping hand along the way.
Yeah, source of fire for you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's that old Stoic mantra, the obstacle is the way. I feel like, those challenges are what really turn you into who you are and as a person and an organization. And I wonder, this is kind of maybe a side tangent, but I don't know if this was a part of you guys growing out of that moment as well, but it just seems like you guys are really great at storytelling, which I think a lot of conservation organizations, ones that are doing great things, sometimes really struggle with. But I don't know if you can go into how you've decided to develop that as yourself as a speaker. I feel like you're a really great speaker. You've done some TED Talks, a lot of other public speaking. You raise a lot of funds yourself, and maybe even just as an organization, and how you work with other media groups to get that story out there. How did that become such a big part of what you're doing?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd never done any public speaking, it just became. Yeah, actually, I was asked to do that TEDx talk at the Sydney Opera House in 2013, I believe. But I was given 6 months sort of lead time, and not having that grounding of public speaking, I just went out and started speaking at schools and speaking to kids, tough audience. Just instead of I'd be offered places at assembly to speak, and I would ask, rather than speak at assembly, can I go around and speak to each class independently? Because then you get to do something 10 times instead of doing it once. And it's just practice. And then, to look back now on the speaking side and the storytelling side of things, and, like National Geographic's done a lot of work with me personally, like being on the Speakers Bureau, in that storytelling side of things, and full productions where using, can be sometimes be 150 plus great images in a show, but using those images to tell a story. And for me, it's less about the data and the facts and figures and all of that. Of course, you want to have that in there as your anchors, but it's about relating a story to another individual, or, we're emotional creatures. It's being able to be vulnerable and to be, to have that element of emotion in there so people can relate to it. There's very few people who are going to sit there through a fucking 100 slides of data and go, oh wow, that was enthralling. We need to find ways to be better storytellers. And looking back on all that now, it's three things are: be comfortable about speaking about your story in front of other people, and you can only get that with practice. Know your subject intimately and be passionate about what you're talking about. And if you've got all those things, you've got a story to tell. And there's a lot of, everyone's got a story, whether you're a professor at Oxford or someone who's out there been working as a ranger for 6 weeks. Everyone's got a story, because we've all got a journey, and there's pieces of that journey that everyone can relate to in some way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And, how I got into this world, my background, like I said, is filmmaking. Wasn't really, I loved nature and things like that, but never would have called myself a conservationist. And then the way I kind of came into this story about Rhino Man and the Rangers, what really drew me to it initially was that first time in South Africa, which was back in 2018, meeting some of these men and women for the first time. And I think it's probably something that similar process you went through of just realizing the amount of sacrifices they made for something that was bigger than themselves, and just that passion for it, and the intimate knowledge they have of their surroundings and the wildlife and the work they're doing, and how it connects with, the bigger picture of the world and humanity. It's just like, there's nothing quite like that can really inspire you and connect you with someone. And I think that's, ultimately to bring people to the aid of these men and women. It's, telling their stories. It's hard not to want to support someone that's giving everything for really humanity and the world at large.
Yeah, absolutely beautifully put. And they deserve to have their story told. It's a often thankless job. Men and women out there in the middle of nowhere, have little contact with the outside world, but are doing what I consider to be the most important job on the planet, protecting nature. And then, to take it a level deeper, it's the animals they protect as part of nature as well. Here we have the absolute ultimate voiceless, and us as people that are in positions to be able to not only go out and be part of a constructive system that's going to help to defend these animals and put in holistic systems that get conservation and communities working together, but also to be able to tell that story and try and inspire people on the other side of the world to invest in what it is we do and what it is as an industry that we're responsible for. And it's a tough sell. People say, you got elephants and rhinos and rangers, and it's a great story. But if you look at the US in the largest philanthropic giving nation in the world, in 2020, you had $449 billion that was given to philanthropy in the US. Okay, 29% of that went to religion. Okay, you come down the list, you've got 14% education, you've got 9% at healthcare. You come right down the bottom, and there's a collective group down there. It's environment, it's climate crisis, it's conservation, it's animals that are domestic, it's animals that are wild, both local and international, and all of that collectively makes up 3%. So humans like to invest in humans. And when I say humans, I mean human causes, not humans that are looking after the natural world, but human causes. So it's a tough market space to be in. And some of the reframing of what we do as an organization and just the holistic model that we've since adopted, over our years of evolution, puts us in a place to be raising money from different market sources other than the conservation and environmental space. Education and healthcare collectively, you're already looking at a market space that's almost 8 times bigger than that bottom bracket that we were previously in.
Yeah, and I feel like there's still a lot to cover in little time, but just kind of continuing on that, it's just climate change and biodiversity and all these buzzwords that keep getting floated around. I think people forget that it actually takes people to protect these spaces, and that, a forest in the Amazon actually impacts you at home in another country. It's just hard for people to make those connections, but I think it's our duty to tell those stories and find ways to inspire people to take action, because that's a tiny percentage for something that needs much larger chunk of those funds to be going to it. I don't know, maybe you can kind of take the lead here. I feel like there's a few things I'd like to talk about. Akashinga, maybe giving an overview of that. I feel like that could be a whole podcast in itself. Lead Ranger, which you guys are a part of now, and then kind of leading into some of what you're expanding into. We talked before this podcast, and I was at a workshop that was happening up in Kenya that you guys are a part of with Lead Ranger and a bunch of other partners, and it's just got to hear some of the things that you guys are doing in Mozambique and some other places. And yeah, there's just a ton going on. So I don't know if maybe you can take us through some of those areas that you guys are really focusing on and why they're important and some of the stories connected to them.
Yeah. Akashinga was born out of a desire to try and do things differently in terms of conservation. The project in Mozambique that I spoke about earlier had just become increasingly militarized, and some of the people that were involved with that project were militarizing it even further than what I'd previously thought. You're talking about drones, helicopters, canine attack teams, multiple personnel from different government departments, and we essentially had a war with the local community. And it was just that it was the understanding that, yes, we're stopping poachers from coming through from here, from Mozambique into Kruger National Park, but it was the knowledge that what we were doing wasn't a long-term solution. We were fighting a war that ultimately was never going to be won. You've got a continent that's going to have 2 billion people on it by 2040. Bigger fences and more guns are not going to preserve nature at scale. It'll be the people of this continent, its greatest asset, that preserve nature, only when they're motivated enough to do it. And we had to find that formula. It was a product of pressure and time. And I just didn't want to be a part of where we'd gone, the direction that we'd gone down in an extreme way. And to the extent that we'd beaten this drum of guns and ammo and fortress conservation so loudly for so long, I really wanted to be a part of steering our narrative and that narrative back in a different direction.
Do you think this is where some of the criticism of green militarization comes from? I mean, I feel like it's a nuanced conversation as well, and it's sometimes gets pushed one way or the other way too far. But the argument that all this money that's going towards militarization could be used in a different way.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And we were part of that narrative, and I'd been part of it by that stage for 8 years. It was a series of things that happened. Us pulling out of Mozambique, handing the contract over to local stakeholders, deciding that we weren't going to be a service provider anymore in terms of going out and training other rangers. And Lead Ranger is different. We refined basically all the stuff we're doing into 2 programs. Lead Ranger, which started in 2017, not going out training rangers, training the instructors so they can train their own rangers, and not going out and working on land that we didn't have some sort of long-term mandate or vested interest in. And that vested interest has become long-term land leases in the vacancy of the leases that the hunting industry would have otherwise occupied. And with the decline of the hunting industry, so much land becoming available that would otherwise be lost to agriculture or human settlement. So that, combined with a lot of research that I'd have done into women's empowerment in other industries and the position of the empowerment of women within conservation, the tokenism that was applied to many women in many positions in conservation and not being given the opportunities to gain the experience that they would otherwise need to evolve into management positions with the depth of knowledge and experience that they need to make the right decisions when things get rough. There was a combination of factors and ingredients going into a shift in my mindset into wanting to trial a program which became Akashinga, but it was the recruitment, training or selection and training of an initial 16 women in rural Zimbabwe. Started training under a tree on a blackboard with a group of women that were survivors of domestic violence, serious sexual assault, AIDS orphans, single mothers, and abandoned wives. And that program started on a vacant hunting block because no one else would give us the opportunity to trial something like that. We had to start somewhere that, in a place that was a lost cause because there was nothing left to lose in the eyes of the stakeholders and communities there. And that program has grown into what it is today, a portfolio now across 3 countries of just under 4 million hectares under contracts ranging from 20 to 41 years. with another 700,000 hectares under negotiation at the moment. I won't say exactly where because it's obviously under negotiation, so it's still, we don't want to jump the gun. But yeah, it's something that's grown from an idea into a model, and I'm finding myself increasingly in positions of being able to give advice to other governments or other organisations on how to scale programs that create greater opportunities for women in conservation and be able to benefit from the dynamics of having women involved in a position that of which law enforcement is an element, but not the element. After 5 years, nearly 6 years on this project, the key components of Akashinga that have made it successful is an almost complete cessation of corruption in our operations, which is the women just seeming to be focused on bringing in an income and looking after the family. Most of the women within 18 months of joining the program have bought their own land and built their own house. And for many of them, that means getting their families back together. These women aren't going to jeopardize that for all the tea in China, their focus. The other key component, I would say, is a de-escalation in tension and potentially conflicting situations with local communities. The lack of corruption with the women means we don't have to recruit from far afield. We can recruit directly from the communities alongside the area we're protecting. It puts the funding that we would otherwise pay into salaries that would be taken back to places sometimes hundreds of kilometres away. It puts that back into the local community at household level, into the hands of women that spend 80 to 90% of their salary on family and local community versus a male that spends 30 to 40%. But the de-escalation that comes from different value system, and I can say this as a guy that's built a career across 3 continents in training men for frontline deployment, whether it be in conservation, law enforcement, or in the military. I can say that as a guy who has come from special operations units, which are the ultimate boys' club. I can look at the difference that women bring into this role and what that means in rebuilding the broken bridge between conservation and communities. And it is such an important factor. We're spending about a third per hectare per annum in protecting, or in our initial areas of protecting the Zambezi Valley section of Zimbabwe than what we were protecting the border of Kruger National Park. Spending about a third on law enforcement. So every dollar that we save on law enforcement, because we don't have helicopters, we don't have aircraft and canine attack teams and drones, we have something far more powerful than biceps and bullets. We have interpersonal relationships that are driven by the women with the communities that they grew up in and the communities that they're raising their own families in. And every dollar that we save by not having to militarize is reinvested back into the communities in terms of healthcare, education, provision of clean water, infrastructure development. And it's like this cycle. It's like every dollar we spend in the community seems to be $1 or $2 less we have to spend on law enforcement. And this cycle is just perpetuated. And I'd say this sort of evolving model of conservation that we've been able to take out. And it's not perfect. We're still testing and adjusting, and it's different in each area that we go to. But it for us is something that has been so worthwhile enough that we have spent every waking moment trying to replicate it and grow it. And we're not trying to sell it into new places now. We're actually working with invitations of communities and governments that are asking us to implement.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, going into this, did you have any idea that some of these outcomes would come up out of this, or was a lot of this kind of just surprising, trying something new, trying to bring women more into conservation? I mean, the corruption is such a huge thing, and just thinking about different motivations between men and women a lot of times and how that can affect those outcomes. I mean, how much of this was a surprise to you as this all took off?
There was a lot of research behind the decision to start this initial unit, and that research told us there's an overwhelming body of evidence that would indicate that empowering women is the single greatest force for positive change in Africa. And the largest line items in our budgets are salaries for rangers, and if we could find a way to to get that into the communities at household level, into the hands of women, then we would centralize the conservation strategy around social development, with social development being centralized around women's empowerment. And that became our greatest tool. And we reversed the way that we look at conservation and had looked at conservation. We started looking at it from the community in rather than the reserve out. And from doing it from a community aspect, a social investment to achieve conservation outcomes, the single most effective dollar that can be spent is on the empowerment of women. So, and I say this now, sitting here, all these years later, we're not even a women's empowerment organisation. We've just found a better way to do business, and to have the empowerment of women central to a key project such as Akashinga for us is not just a matter of changing the role of men for women and carrying on with our daily business. We actually had to go back and rebuild the organisation, and that required 2 independent gender mainstreaming audits to be done, which could tell us how we could be a better organisation, to build a better platform, to expand a program like Akashinga. And that's everything from policy and procedure, code of conduct and ethics, board makeup, management positions, basically, everything that we would need to be a diverse and inclusive organisation where women were not only a part of the organisation but could be a key part. And I'm still the CEO of the organisation, but our director of operations, Dominic Noom, who you would have met in Kenya, absolute force of nature. Our executive director in the United States, Melody Weston. We've got a bunch of key management positions and board positions that are now filled by women, which would otherwise have previously been former military or special operations parts.
Yeah, really amazing. Also, people can check out a great short film on Akashinga. It gives an overview of what you guys are doing and some of the training these women go through and challenges and success stories as well. So that's on your website, right? I think it's available.
Yeah, so it's on the website. So if you go just IAPF.org, you'll see there's a section there called the film. Yeah, people can watch it. And again, that's it is a particular lens into one of the roles of the women of Akashinga. It's predominantly law enforcement focused. We're doing more work outside reserves than what we do inside. I've just come back from visiting schools that we've helped rebuild, clinics that have been rebuilt that have solar electricity, medication, nurse, their roads, boreholes, pumps, town halls, and then, of course, employment being our biggest community investment. 95% of our staff coming from within 20 kilometres of the boundary of the area we protect. Then there's the monitoring and evaluation inside and outside the reserve, the scientific teams, the chief scientists in each country, the analysts, the wildlife crime units, and then, of course, the rangers that are collecting a lot of this data and at some point have to also do the job of law enforcement. And I know you've discussed this a lot on previous podcasts that I've listened to. The job of a ranger is so broad, and it's very easy for us to try and perceive that responsibility to be narrow and law enforcement and anti-poaching. But it really is. It's in my mind, their first job is to be the conduit between the wilderness area being protected and the communities that surround these areas and outnumber our staff in thousands, sometimes the tens of thousands. And these rangers are the voice of reason that will motivate that conservation from the communities.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. And, Anton Zimba, who's really the hero of our film, was killed not too long ago, a few months ago.
Yeah.
I mean, he was one of those rangers that just completely understood his role on the inside is kind of this final line of defense, but also as a bridge between the communities and the conservation spaces. And, he was such a great communicator on both sides of the fence in South Africa. And I think those skills are so important and, often overlooked. Like you said, it's easy to kind of get hyper-focused on that anti-poaching side, but you need both. And supporting men and women that are able to kind of make that bridge is important as well. And sharing with people that's a bigger part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. We idolize as a global community, football players and movie stars, and these are people making millions and millions of dollars. And, the real superheroes are the ones out there right now, giving up their lives and living in remote locations for minimal salary to protect a system that we've, to put bluntly, have been so persistent in trying to fuck up. It's the best self-regulating system we have as a planet. I mean, it's a system that's taken more than 5 billion years to refine. We don't need massive solutions. We just need to protect nature and let nature do its thing. And these are the people that do it.
So looking forward, I feel like you've mentioned a lot of the different things you're doing right now. Is there anything else you want to share that IAPF is moving towards, other than a great rebrand here, which we'll see soon? But what other kind of work are you doing? How are you expanding, growing?
Yeah, look, it's been a significant couple of years for us in terms of growth. It took us a decade to get to $1 million, and then it went from 1 to 3 and 3 to 9 million. We've got significant investment. A lot of it is matched, so we've still got to go out and match dollar for dollar every dollar that we're going to bring in. But being in a really positive position, looking forward financially, with the systems created, the foundation built, the staff and the team that we have. I cannot say enough about the staff and the management and the rangers, just absolutely everyone involved, from the cooks to the lawyers, to the graphic designers, to the country managers, to the fundraisers, the analysts, the scientists, the rangers. Everyone knows that their job is as important as each other's, and that without that machine going, no one else's job would be as relevant or as functional. So I just take this opportunity to thank our staff and the people that are involved with this organisation. There's people that have left long-standing positions with organisations much bigger than us, to come and be a part of this growth and this vision and where we're going. There's people that have moved from overseas. There's people that are taking risks right now. So just being a part of that team is very humbling. Where we're going, I would say, with our projects and the expansion of Akashinga, we'd like to have 15 million hectares under contract by the end of the decade. We've been spending a lot of money up front, a lot of capital securing land, and now we're sort of growing into that responsibility, if that makes sense. Filling out the systems and programs on the ground to protect these areas long term. And then, of course, Lead Ranger, with what Boris and Dominic built in partnership with the Thin Green Line Foundation and Ranger Campus. Just, to see such impact across such a wide area. And I was just chatting with Boris earlier. I mean, just throw some numbers at you. So the area protected by the instructors that have been trained and the rangers that work for those instructors is 135,000 kilometres squared, and that's around the size of Greece. So the ability to be able to go out and work with leaders from existing and well-established organisations from now 8 countries across Southern and East Africa and West Africa too, and be able to build a instructional capacity into these organisations, I think is what we identified years back as one of the biggest gaps in the conservation industry, of being leadership. The knowledge that the difference between a successful project and a failed project is often the person sitting at the top of that project. Just trying to continually build that capacity and that program out. Dominic's obviously come across to IAPF full time, but Boris leading that program. If all I did for the rest of my life was work with Lead Ranger and Akashinga and growing those programs, I couldn't think of a better way to achieve what it is that I want to do with my life, and that's be part of teams that help protect as much of the natural world as possible.
Yeah, so many really great things coming together, and so many good people. I've had the fortune of meeting a fair amount of them so far. So yeah, really excited to see how things develop in the coming years and follow your guys' progress.
Thanks so much, John.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any advice for someone that might be, maybe they're kind of on the cusp of taking that leap, but they're struggling to find the courage to move on? What would you tell them? Maybe what would you tell them to think about or introspect about to get themselves moving in the right direction?
Don't turn on the news. Don't turn on the news and watch it for half an hour. The world's fucking burning, or it's flooding, or it's heating up, or it's cooking. Shit's going extinct. Our wilderness across the planet is shrinking. Some people would look at this with a fatalist mentality. I would look at it and say there's never been a more exciting time in history to be alive and to be fighting for something worth fighting for, because this is literally the future of our civilization and species at stake here. Find a way to get involved, make changes in your own daily life at home. That's the absolute easiest way and most immediate way that we can have an effect. But find a way to be involved. I look at our patron, head of our advisory board and personal inspiration and good friend and mentor, Jane Goodall. And looking at her career tells me that conservation is not a pastime. It's not a hobby. It's not a phase. It's a lifelong commitment, and it's got to be. It's got to be. It's not always going to be a high-paying job. You're not always going to be there front and center, or living in a fancy city somewhere. Maybe you are. Maybe your role is raising funds or supporting other organisations, whatever it may be. But there's very little that's glamorous about conservation. But there's everything to gain and everything to lose, depending on how we choose to make the best use of the time we all have as individuals on this planet. Nature, as I said, has evolved over billions of years. We as humans, we don't have billions of years to evolve. We've got a handful of decades at most, at best, to cut away the bits that don't work and keep the bits that do, and do something absolutely constructive with this short time we have on this planet. I wanted to research the odds of us being us, you being you, me being me, and what are our chances of being born on this planet. And I spoke about that distribution of funding in the US. 29% of funding going to religion. That's people betting on what's going to happen after this life. But I can tell you the odds of you being born as you and me being born as me, it's 400 trillion to 1. 400 trillion to 1 that we're born. We've already won the fucking jackpot. This is it. Okay, so we've got a short space of time to do as much as possible. And this is the biggest fight we've ever had in history. And it's on our hands right now. So I don't think there's anything more motivating, getting off your ass and going out there and doing something that's constructive for the planet.
Yeah, really, really well put. I don't know if there's anything else you want to leave us with, but this has been a great conversation.
Mate, thank you so much for everything you do and shining a light on the true superheroes of this planet. Absolutely grateful for what you do and what you're part of and what you're about. So thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. The feeling's mutual, and really honored to have you on this show, and just the work you're doing is so amazing and needed. And thank you for the continued motivation as well, just with your words and telling the stories of the people that you're working with. So thanks so much, Damien. Really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.